Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today we are cracking open a seriously fascinating historical puzzle, the twofold strategy that the British East India Company used to consolidate power across the entire Indian subcontinent. So, how exactly did a trading company conquer an entire subcontinent without fighting every single battle? It's a wild question, right? We're talking about a corporate entity, literally a business that somehow managed to build a massive empire. And the secret? Well, they didn't just do it with cannons and cavalry. They did it with contracts, treaties, and honestly, an unbelievable amount of paperwork. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is the fundamental premise of our explainer. The East India Company's expansion relied heavily on what's called a twofold method. Basically, on one hand, you have direct military conquest, the sword, right? Waging outright war to defeat major powers. But on the other hand, you have the pen. We're talking insidious administrative mechanisms and really complex diplomacy. It was this exact combination of sheer force and bureaucratic red tape that allowed them to swallow up so much territory. All right, here is our roadmap for today. First, the rise of Ranjit Singh. Second, the fall of the Sikh Empire. Third, conquest by the pen. Fourth, the doctrine of lapse. And finally, securing the imperial frontiers. Part 1. The rise of Ranjit Singh. Forging an empire with blood and iron. So, to really understand British military expansion in the Northwest, we first have to appreciate the sheer strength of the Sikh Empire before the company ever made its move. Back in the late 18th century, Punjab was kind of in a state of anarchy. It was divided into 12 Sikh missals, which were essentially these military brotherhoods. But then, enter Ranjit Singh. This guy showed incredible political acumen from a very young age. He saw the regional chaos, noticed a civil war happening next door in Afghanistan, and totally exploited the situation. Using a ruthless political strategy known literally as blood and iron, he managed to consolidate power. By 1805, he controlled Lahore, the political capital, and Amritsar, the religious capital. And over the next few decades, his formidable army pushed west, conquering Multan, Kashmir, and Peshawar. He forged a remarkably strong, unified Punjab. Moving on to Part 2, the fall of the Sikh Empire. The collapse of order and the heavy cost of defeat. The thing is, as insanely strong as Ranjit Singh was, his empire's stability rested pretty much entirely on his shoulders. So when he died in June 1839, things unraveled incredibly fast. His successor, Karak Singh, died shortly after, and then get this, his son died in a freak accident right after the funeral. This created a massive power vacuum. You had court factions fighting for control, and the local army growing super powerful and increasingly paranoid about the English massing troops right on their border. All this chaos culminated in the Sikh army crossing the Sutlej River in 1845. Naturally, the British used this as their perfect justification to declare the First Anglo-Sikh War. If you trace the timeline of events, in just 10 short years, the empire went from its absolute peak to total British annexation. Now, the British won that first war, and they immediately slapped them with the Treaty of Lahore. The company essentially carved up the state like a pie. They directly annexed the Jalandhar Doab territory. They stationed a British resident right in Lahore to keep a watchful eye on everything. They drastically reduced the size of the once mighty Sikh army, and they basically said, okay, young Dalip Singh is the ruler now, but only under a regent. Now, what's really interesting here is this number, 1 crore rupees. That was the huge war indemnity the British demanded from the Sikhs. It was a completely impossible sum for them to pay. In fact, to pay off just a fraction of this massive debt, the Sikhs were actually forced to sell Kashmir to a man named Gulab Singh for 75 lakh rupees. Think about that for a second. The British forced their defeated enemies to literally liquidate parts of their own empire just to pay for the war they had just lost. Well, naturally, the Sikhs were absolutely furious about losing Kashmir, and that sparked a rebellion. The British responded with the Treaty of Byrawal, stripping the region of her power and installing a council that was entirely dictated by the British resident. At this point, tensions were at an absolute boiling point. The final straw came when a local Sikh governor in Multan revolted over tax increases. Lord Dalhousie, who was all about aggressive British expansion, leaped at this excuse. The Second Anglo-Sikh War kicked off, and it ended in 1849 with the complete surrender of the Sikh army. The sword had officially done its work. Punjab was fully annexed. Which brings us to Part 3, Conquest by the Pen, swallowing independent states with contracts and loopholes. We are going to pivot, sharply right here. Because while military campaigns, the cannons and cavalry, conquered Punjab, it was actually administrative paperwork, sneaky legal loopholes, and contracts that quietly choked out the rest of India. The seeds of this were planted with Warren Hastings and his policy of ring fence. Now, it sounds purely defensive, right? The idea was to create buffer zones. The British would defend their neighbors' frontiers to make sure enemies never even reached the company's own borders. The very first Indian state to fall into this little protection trap was Awadh in 1765. The company pledged to defend Awadh, sure, but the Nawab of Awadh had to pay all the expenses for that British defense. This was the quiet, insidious precursor to total subjugation. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how that ring fence evolved into Lord Wellesley's massive bureaucratic trap known as the Subsidiary Alliance. It happened in 4 super methodical stages. First, the company offers troops to help a friendly state fight a war. Second, the British actually take the field and fight alongside them. Third, the trap springs. The arrangement shifts and the British ask for money to permanently maintain a fixed British contingent for the ruler's protection. And finally, stage 4, the protection fee is set impossibly high. When the Indian ruler inevitably fails to pay on time, the British just seize a chunk of their territory as payment. It's a brutal cycle. The ruler buys security, but in the process, loses their revenue, their independence, and eventually, their actual land. Part 4. The Doctrine of Lapse. The domino effect of death and succession. So, if the Subsidiary Alliance was basically a massive financial trap, the Doctrine of Lapse was purely a legal loophole. And Lord Dalhousie absolutely loved it, using it to capitalize whenever an Indian ruler died. Here's the crucial point. Under traditional Hindu law and local customs, if a ruler didn't have a biological male heir, he could adopt a son to inherit both his private property and the throne. Well, Dalhousie's Doctrine of Lapse completely twisted how this was interpreted. The British suddenly declared, sure, an adopted son can inherit your private property, but he cannot inherit the state itself. Instead, the state would lapse back to the British paramount power. Literally with the stroke of a pen, they manipulated local laws, vetoed succession rights, and legally stole entire kingdoms. Just think about the staggering scale of this bureaucratic conquest. Satara, Jhansi, and Nagpur all wiped off the map as independent entities purely because of this doctrine of lapse. And then there's Awadh at the bottom. Annexed in 1856, not even because of a succession issue, but simply because Dalhousie deposed the Nawab, claiming misgovernment. In just an 8-year tenure, Dalhousie added 250,000 square miles to British territory, 250,000, all acquired without a single pitched battle, just ruthless paperwork. And that leads us to Part 5, Securing the Imperial Frontiers, the geopolitical game for Afghanistan. All right, so now that the British East India Company had swallowed up this vast subcontinent using both the sword and the pen, they had to figure out how to defend its massive borders. This sparked a huge debate on how to handle the super volatile northwestern border near Afghanistan, especially with the Russian Empire kind of looming in the distance. We see 2 fundamentally different approaches here. John Lawrence championed something called masterly inactivity. His philosophy was pretty simple: just leave Afghanistan alone. Maintain peace, don't get involved in their civil wars, and they won't go asking foreign powers for help. But then, years later, you have Lord Lytton. He absolutely hated ambiguity and pushed this aggressive policy of proud reserve. Lytton wanted what he called scientific frontiers, so he actively interfered in Afghanistan, demanding they host a British envoy. And when the emir refused, well, Lytton's aggression directly sparked the Second Anglo-Afghan War. The British invaded, the emir fled, and his son was basically forced to sign the Treaty of Gandamak in May of 1879. And if you look at the terms, they sound incredibly familiar, right? They directly echo the subsidiary alliances from decades earlier. The new emir was forced to conduct his entire foreign policy based solely on British advice. He had to accept a permanent British resident stationed right in Kabul, and in return, he got an annual subsidy and military support. The British had essentially turned Afghanistan into a heavily monitored buffer state to protect against Russia. All of this constant frontier maneuvering eventually solidified into a literal line on a map, 2,611 kilometers. To put that into perspective, that number is the exact length of the Durand Line. This boundary, which was drawn up way back then to separate Afghan and British territories, is actually the modern international border between Afghanistan and Pakistan today. It was born entirely out of these 19th century frontier policies and a corporate desire to protect imperial assets. Which leaves us with this really powerful, lingering thought. If a single trading company's administrative paperwork, their legal loopholes, their unpayable war indemnities, and their buffer zone treaties effectively drew the borders of modern nations, well, how much of today's geopolitical map is just a permanent legacy of 19th century corporate contracts? As you've seen, the British East India Company wielded both the sword and the pen with devastating efficiency. But while swords eventually rust, the ink on those treaties permanently scarred and reshaped the entire globe. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this changes how you look at the lines on our world map today.